Thank you very much. It's time for our first panel discussion today, and I welcome Ms. Johanna Ikävalko, the Director of the Arctic Center of the University of Lapland, to moderate the panel on Arctic research cooperation in the current geopolitical situation and beyond. Ms. Ikävalko, please.
Thank you and good morning, everyone. My name is Johanna Ikävalko and I'm the director of the Arctic Center at the University of Lapland. So I come from the real Arctic. And my pleasure is to moderate this discussion about how the current geopolitical situation has changed our prerequisites to do Arctic research, because it has certainly affected the Arctic Center and our research. I have to say that end of February, one of our crown jewels dropped off. We were very proud, the Arctic Center was very proud of its long history of cooperation with Russian organizations and researchers. And just in one day, everything was cut off. We don't have that anymore. And now we are seeking for opportunities and alternatives. The Arctic is still there. The need to study the Arctic is still there more than ever. But then how do we do that without our Russian counterparts? So this is now the question that I'm going to raise to my dear panel today. And I'm going to invite, we have 7 panelists, and I'm going to invite them one by one to the podium, introduce them, and then ask the one and same question to each one of them. And I start from Dr. Rasmus Leander Nielsen, who is the head of NACIFIC, Center for Foreign and Security Policy, and associate professor at the Department of Arctic Social Science and Economics, University of Greenland. His main research interests include Greenlandic foreign policy, Arctic security and cooperation, and international relations and EU studies. Rasmus is a widely used expert and commentator on Greenlandic and Arctic affairs. Welcome, Rasmus.
Thank you.
My question to you, and this is to all panelists in my panel, is how has the current or the changed geopolitical situation affected your work?
We don't, at my university, work that closely with Russian scholars. I've been in a couple of networks where, unfortunately, we had to exclude or wait and see. But I was actually thinking about with this topic, we have this time of year, we have a reflection of what happened in the past year. We have this live case of having the most hampering to Arctic cooperation in decades. I mean, there were long periods of the Cold War. There was more collaboration with the Russians or the Soviet Union than there is now. And I remember back in March, I was at a conference, the Arctic Encounters, with Mike, who's going to be on a panel. I think I can't see him from here. And no one was really knowing what we were talking about. What are we supposed to do with Arctic cooperation in terms of that? And then we've been up to a handful of conferences, and we don't know that much more than we did back then. But now we're starting to see, not everybody, as we could see from Estonian MPA and others in Pentagon, etc., but everybody thinks that eventually we really do need to start collaborating with the Russians again. And we do see this, what economists call the time inconsistency problem, that in the short run, it's normatively the correct decision to put a pause to the Arctic Council, to the umbrella of Arctic collaborations. But in the long run, we really need to start collaborating again. So how do we go from the short run in the long run, we're all dead, but eventually, and hopefully somewhat soon, we need to start collaborating again. And I won't say that researchers are going to save the world, but this is one field that we need to start working with Russian colleagues again. There's a lot of knowledge on climate change, but also the next generation of PhD students from Russia coming to Tromsø or coming to other universities, that this network of scholars need to be re-established somehow. I don't have the answer how we get from the short run to the long run, but it is really vital that we get from over the first couple of stumbling blocks that we are seeing now, I would say. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rasmus. I hope that this panel or the audience actually have some answers or solutions to our problem. And research is certainly needed in order to support decision making, at least. My next speaker will be Nicole Biebow. She is the coordinator of the EU project EU PolarNet 2, having previously served as an executive manager of EU PolarNet 1. She's also the coordinator of the EU-funded Arctic Research Icebreaker Consortium. And in October 2021, she was elected as the chair of the European Polar Board, EPB. She leads the International Cooperation Unit at the Alfred Wegener Institute in Germany and is responsible for all international relations of this AVI. She maintains an extensive network of contacts in the European and international science and policy communities. Nicole received her PhD in marine geology at Geomar in Kiel in 1996. Welcome, Nicole.
Thank you, Johanna.
Now, how has the changed geopolitical situation affected your work?
So, as you said, I'm coming from the Alfred Wegener Institute in Germany, and this is an institute of natural science. We exclusively perform natural science, and Russia was one of our main cooperation partners since the wall came down. And our institute is massively affected. So we have had a joint station in the Lena Delta where we perform long-term observation on the thawing of permafrost and carbon balances. This is closed, of course. We had a joint laboratory in St. Petersburg to train Russian PhD students and to also analyze our samples there. This is paused. We had a joint master program with the University of St. Petersburg, St. Petersburg State University, to educate students in polar and marine research. This is paused. We have, as I said, we lost nearly the research in half of the Arctic. So, and this is, of course, a critical problem to understand the processes of climate change in the Arctic. So, it is not only science which is affected by that. We have 15 PhD students who will never finalize their PhD thesis anymore because they cannot analyze the data and they cannot publish the data because we also, in Germany at least, have a ban of publishing data with Russian scientists. And finally, and this also holds true for me because I spent 7 years of my life in Vladivostok, we have a lot of personal issues and a lot of sensitivity. We have a lot of couples, Russian-German couples, of course, due to our long history and cooperation. And these people are worried and in bad shape. So we lost a significant part of our research capacities. And you know that AVI was the initiator of this big mosaic expedition, which we could perform with 20 countries on board and about 450 scientists, even during COVID times, which was extremely challenging. But we could perform it only because we have got the support of Russia. They helped us in this time. So you see, we had very close connections, and we will never be able in the next year to do these big international initiatives which we need to understand the climate in the Arctic, urgently need, and climate change does not stop due to geopolitical situations. when we not somehow find a solution how we can, at least at a very low scientist to scientist level, continue the important long-term measurements which we are performing, and not only are we, the whole European and international community in physics, in biology, and so on, is performing in the Arctic.
Thank you, Nicole. I think that if I continue asking this same question from all panelists, I will soon have to throw some cleanest tissues from here, because we all start to cry. Peter Sköld is a professor of history, Sami culture, and society development at Umeå University, Sweden. He is the former director at the Arctic Center, at the Center of Arctic Research. Peter's research profile includes Arctic sustainable development, historical demography, population statistics, indigenous health transitions, and northern cultures. He was one of the authors of Arctic Human Development Report 2. Peter has an active engagement in Arctic research planning, in stakeholder cooperation, and international cooperation. Peter was the chair of Board of Governors of the University of the Arctic, UArctic, many of you know, and former president of International Arctic Social Sciences Associations, IASA, and past chair of the Working Group on Human and Social Sciences in the International Arctic Science Committee, IASC. He's also a Swedish delegate of Arctic Council Culture, Economy and Geography Expert Group, and deputy director of the Chinese Nordic Arctic Research Center. In 2015, Peter was appointed honorary consul of Västerbotten to Latvia, and in 2016, he was appointed official climate ambassador of Västerbotten. And after reading all this, I wonder how come you have time to be here, but I'm very happy to have you here. Peter, how has the changed geopolitical situation affected your work?
Thank you, Johanna. Yes, that was an extensive introduction, I'm sorry. But it also tells that I have had a long international commitment in cooperation in Arctic research. And from that perspective, of course, we see, and we have already heard, how the situation now has affected us. We know that many projects linked to the Arctic Council have been paused, some of them reactivated again. This is true even more for the cooperation within the Barents-Euro-Arctic Council, where Russia is the major part, of course. That cooperation is still completely stopped, I'm afraid. And that is very sad, not least for the regional development and cooperation in the north, in the Scandinavian countries and Russia, with a long shared history, and where we for 30 years, I mean, I was in this cooperation even before the 1990s, and we introduced Russian colleagues to our cooperation, and we have seen this developed over more than 3 decades now, and being interrupted in a way we could never expect. I cannot say enough how sad I really am over this situation. We see how this, of course, also affects the international research organizations, such as University of the Arctic, who have worked to introduce Russian researchers to networks and research cooperation, who have established mobility programs with students, where hundreds of Russian students have come to Western universities and been introduced to our research activities. And these investments seem, well, insecure now. We will not know how they can develop in the near future. And we see how the planning processes are affected. I really hope that there will be an international polar year in the early 30s. The planning has halted a bit, of course, which is true also for the ICARP4 process that is essential for the international research cooperation. And we also see how trust has been impacted. And that is not only for Russia. We have been working for a long time with countries that are non-democratic. We have found ways to do that, including China, for example. But that cooperation has been built on trust, and that trust has to be tested again. I have decided to be optimist. I have decided to believe that there is a way forward in international cooperation, including partners in both Russia and China. I'm not sure, as Rasmus said, how this will be done, but I will try to do my best to make it happen.
Thank you very much, Peter. In order to increase the diversity of this panel, I'm very pleased to introduce you to Professor Veli-Pekka Tynkkynen. He's a professor in the Russian Environmental Studies at the Aleksanteri Institute, Finnish Center for Russian and Eastern European Studies at the University of Helsinki. He has the title of docent in Russian Resource and Energy Policy at the National Defense University in Finland. Veli-Pekka has led several academic research projects with wide international collaboration, and now he is leading the research group on the Russian environment that consists of dozens of researchers focusing on energy and environmental policies. Energy security, political power and culture in Russia. At the moment, Veli-Pekka's team is focusing on visualization and politicization of energy and waste flows in Russia and Finland. He outlines his multidisciplinary take on Russia in his book, The Energy of Russia, Hydrocarbon Culture and Climate Change, which I have not read yet. Professor Tynkkynen is an experienced speaker with a wide track record in giving lectures and courses at European and Russian universities. Veli-Pekka has delivered tens of public talks, is frequently giving expert statements for authorities, as well as is an often asked commentator at media, like this morning here in Brussels, and you see him on Finnish television almost on a weekly basis, if even not more often than that. Veli-Pekka, the question to you is also the same. How has the changed geopolitical situation affected your work?
Well, can you hear me? Yeah. Thank you for the invitation and yeah, long words about my research. It has, of course, impacted my work very drastically. If you think of me as a Russia scholar, energy scholar, and climate scholar, these three topics are extremely important in Europe, in the world at the moment. Directly, of course, if I think of my research team, I have several scholars with the Russian background, but actually 3 Russian scholars who actually, before the invasion, worked in St. Petersburg. Now they have fled the country. So they are part of that Russia that is fleeing the country. So in that sense, they're directly impacting my research. But luckily, actually, we're able to continue research because these scholars are not in those universities that signed the letter in favor of the war. In March, you remember this letter of Russian rectors of universities that signed that we are in favor of the war. These people, I chose these people beforehand. They are not part of that. So in that sense, we're lucky. We're able to continue. And actually next week, one of my scholars is going from Yerevan to Komi Republic to do research. So field work continues. So we're lucky. But on the kind of bigger picture, if I think of the kind of talks here before me, and of course sorry feeling that this cooperation, especially on the natural sciences side, which I understand has been extensive and that has ended. And I, as a scholar looking at geopolitical issues, energy security issues, I see that definitely, of course, the Russian academic society was genuinely believing in cooperation, believing in cooperation and doing research on climate change, for example. I don't doubt that. But I tend to think about on the level of regime. If you look at Putin's regime, how they utilize different sectors of society and life for their benefit. Certainly, this cooperation also in the Arctic has been utilized to build this camouflage that we are in the interdependency frame here together with Europe. Unfortunately, this is the case. And I see the same on the side of energy. For decades, Russia spoke that don't mix geopolitics and energy policy. They're not interrelated, but they are, and now we see the effects. And in a similar way, unfortunately, the academic community in the Arctic is not in a bubble. We're not separate from the geopolitical factors. So I think this is the factor I think we need to also discuss. How we're able to establish the connections and cooperation in the future. We shouldn't be, in a way, too naive.
Thank you, Veli-Pekka. This is very typical Scandinavian talk. You say straight how things are. Are you prepared? Now I'm very honored to invite here Mike Sfraga to get an US aspect to this topic or issue, if we want to call it like that. Dr. Michael Sfraga was appointed in September 2021 by President Joe Biden, Chair, United States Arctic Research Commission. Mike is the founding director of the Polar Institute and served as the director of the Global Risk and Resilience Program at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. Mike currently serves as chair and distinguished fellow in the Polar Institute, where his scholarship and public speaking focus is on Arctic policy. Mike is an Alaskan and a geographer by training, and his work focuses on the changing geography of the Arctic and Antarctic landscapes, Arctic policy, and the impacts and implications of a changing climate on political, social, economic, environmental, and security regimes in the Arctic. Mike served as distinguished co-lead scholar for the US Department of State's inaugural Fulbright Arctic Initiative from 2015 to 2017, a complementary program to the US chairmanship of the Arctic Council. He held the same position from 2017 to 2019. Mike, how has the current geopolitical situation or climate affected your work?
Thank you very much. It's wonderful to be on a panel of friends and colleagues. You come to these conferences to learn, and you certainly learn, even when there's just introductions of your colleagues who you've known for so long. You always learn something more about them. Well, it's fundamentally changed in the very same way that you've already heard. But I would tell you from the Research Commission's perspective, we represent, of course, the United States, but we work internationally with our colleagues across the globe, not just in the North. It's forced us as 7 presidentially appointed commissioners to think about a way forward through our reality. We're not going to change what has happened, and it's up to others to help negotiate what moves forward in the realm of the bigger geopolitics, and can't ignore a war in this continent. But there are a couple of things that have been going on in the United States that have grabbed our focus. So I guess my answer to the question is this: we're moving forward where we can, and where we should, and where we need to be. That's just a simple fact. So our focus has been, over the last year, to build for the United States a set of goals and objectives for Arctic research that help to drive and inform and influence where the United States goes in the next coming 2 to 5 years. That's what we've been focused on. We have that almost done. That will go to the president sometime in mid-January. But that's informed and influenced by discussions that have been going on where we have been concurrently building a national strategy for the Arctic region. So perhaps my answer, Johanna, would be this, is that many of you know that the United States released a national strategy for the Arctic region. There are 4 pillars in that strategy. The 5 goals and objectives of the U.S. Arctic Research Commission complement and enable those 4 pillars in some varying ways. So where we would have been discussing with Russian colleagues and others bilateral, multilateral efforts, we've decided to double down on what we can do for the U.S. And a big component of that, of course, is working with colleagues in the North and elsewhere about and for the North. So let me very simply outline for you the 4 pillars that we look at in our national strategy and very briefly tell you what hooks there are for the 5 recommendations that will go to the President on Arctic research. So the first pillar of our national strategy is security, and I would say security writ large, not just hard security. Areas of civil security and soft security. Think about community security and food and water and health, all those components of security. The second is climate change and environmental protection. I don't need to go through that list, you know that list. Sustainable economic development, and the fourth is international cooperation and governance. Those are the 4 pillars for the United States moving forward for the next 10 years. I have to make sure that our commission is enabling and reinforcing and influencing what happens in those 4 areas related to research, and rely on you, many colleagues in the North, to help advance not just the US interests, but our collective interests through these 5 goals that will go to the President later on in 2023. Our 5 goals are to advance research in areas of environmental risks and hazard. So you already see the connection between our goals and our national strategy. The second is community health and well-being. That's a line from the United States Arctic Research Commission, a vision that reflects the needs of our communities. The third is infrastructure, research infrastructure, but just basic infrastructure for the US Arctic, but also thinking about our global Arctic. Economic research, very different for the US Arctic Research Commission. The economies of the North and how you build those economies. Again, the connection with the national strategy for the Arctic region. And fifth, research cooperation at all levels, all components of research. Again, a connection there, but certainly a theme to what you've already heard. So I would just step there by saying that the impacts you've heard already, the same impacts for the United States. So we will look to marry the 2 areas that I've just talked about and do that for the US, but also allies, partners, and nations in and outside of the Arctic.
Thank you so much, Mike. I'm pretty sure that here are many in this room who are more than willing to cooperate with you. In order to get some local aspect to the forthcoming discussion, I'm delighted to invite here Karen van Loon. Karen is a junior researcher at Egmont, the Royal Institute for International Relations in Brussels, where she is currently developing Belgium's first Arctic strategy. She is an experienced educator and capacity building expert who previously worked as a research associate at the Faculty of Social Sciences, University of Antwerp. She has a background in international relations and diplomacy and Eastern European studies. Karen, the floor is yours. How has the current situation affected your work?
Thank you. Good morning. I would like to discuss a perspective from the Belgian scientific research community today, so not necessarily my personal experiences. And this community includes, among others, Belgian universities, but also the Federal Public Planning Service for Science Policy, which is composed of 10 scientific institutions. Yesterday, my fellow Belgian panelists have already discussed our over 125 years tradition in polar research. We have currently 12 research groups at 8 Belgian universities that are active in Arctic scientific research. Since 2015, their research has resulted in over 190 academic publications on Arctic science on topics ranging from cryosphere, atmosphere, terrestrial, marine biology. And earlier this year, we were very proud to say that we were accepted as the 24th member of the International Arctic Science Committee. The current geopolitical situation has clearly affected all this work and ongoing research projects. And the Belgian government strongly condemns Russia's brutal and unprovoked attack against Ukraine. Needless to say, this is a sentiment that our Belgian research community is echoing. Since Belgium is a member state of the EU, this means that our positions and decisions regarding scientific collaboration align with the EU. In practice, this means that institutional collaboration with Russia has halted. Partnerships with the Russian Science Foundation is severed, and there will be no calls for joint research proposals. There is no Belgian funding available for Russian and Belarusian partner institutions. Traveling to Russia and to Belarus for both students and researchers unfortunately can no longer take place in this context. It is clear from all the official statements from the Belgian scientific community that structural cooperation with Russia should not take place, and it is not possible for obvious operational and also administrative reasons. But at the same time, they acknowledge that many Russian academics do not share the views of their government, and Belgian universities leave it up to individual researchers whether or not to continue their contacts with their counterparts in Russia. I have reached out to quite a few of the Belgian Arctic scientists, and they say that this is exactly what they are doing for the time being. Russian students who choose to study at Belgian universities are still welcome, since Belgian universities don't want to make individual Russian students victims of the choices of their regime. There is clearly a need for a global effort to understand, to monitor, to combat, and to adapt to climate change in the Arctic region. And given the gravity of the situation, is it legitimate to place moral objections to Russia's behavior above a pragmatic solution to the global problem? I think I will leave it at this rhetorical question for the time being. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It is obvious that you still have more to say, but not just yet. In order to complete our panel, I'm delighted to have here Anna-Maria Stan, who will provide the EU aspect to our discussions. She's currently working as Policy Officer for Healthy Oceans and Seas in the Directorate General for Research and Innovation, and is in charge of Arctic research. Anna-Maria has previously worked on a variety of education and organization development policy topics inside the Commission's Directorate General for Education and Culture. Prior to joining the European Commission in 2007, she worked with UNESCO in Paris on culture, development, and intercultural dialogue with a focus on indigenous peoples' affairs. Anna-Maria, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and I would first like to greet our audience today and to thank you for taking time to be here. So to answer your question, trying to be brief, we already heard what Nicole said, the other scientists. So of course, my job is related to European polar research. So this already shows how my work is affected. And to understand how research work is affected, it's enough to look at the representation of our globe to see that half of the Arctic is gone if the Russian Federation is not taking part in research projects. Now, coming back to the institutional perspective, what happened after the 24th of February last year, our heads of state and governments took a decision to stop all cooperation with Russian entities in all domains. And this also affected, of course, the Horizon 2020, which was projects were still running. Actually, most projects that were running were from Horizon 2020 and the new program, which meant in practice that for all EU-funded Arctic research projects, they had to stop, to terminate their cooperation with Russian partners. I would like to add to this that international cooperation is a priority for the EU policy for the Arctic and for Arctic research supported by the European Union. And we were very proud that saying that Horizon is actually a very good instrument because it's open to the whole world, and it involved all the Arctic countries and countries interested in Arctic research, which is not the case anymore. If I can just maybe give two examples how it affects research and projects funded by Horizon, we can take the permafrost issue. So the EU-supported Arctic research actually supports the European Green Deal. So a lot of our projects are about the climate change and looking at the future. Now, how do you assess the impact of permafrost thaw on future climate models when you don't have access again to, I mean, just look at the map, it's maybe most of the permafrost is there. And another example would be Arctic observations, because this is one of our main challenges. I'm talking about the global Arctic research community, is to ensure governance for long-term Arctic observation. It's one of the aims of the Arctic Science Ministerial, another process that has been disrupted. And this is another example of process that will have difficulties to get organized, but this doesn't mean that we shouldn't think of ways to keep going the processes that we can keep going and reinforce cooperation with our other partners.
Thank you very much, Anna-Maria. Now, we will start with the questions. Some of them are pre-prepared and some are not. I encourage the audience to raise questions as well, and I also encourage the panelists to ask questions from each other, to have a true grilling going on. And, but I would like to start from Mike to elaborate a little bit or deepen our understanding of the environment that you represent. What is the US Arctic Research Commission, and what role does it play in shaping the US domestic and foreign policy with regard to the Arctic region?
Thank you. Well, I touched a little bit on this before. I should have given you the history, but now I will do it. About 40 years ago, then Senator Frank Murkowski created the Arctic Research Policy Act. It created the United States Arctic Research Commission, and it was done at a time when we weren't having conferences like this. But I'm glad he did this, so that the United States had an independent federal agency. We are independent, and 7 presidentially appointed commissioners help to create and then advance the goals and objectives, the research priorities of the nation, to focus it on the Arctic regions. There are unique needs of our research community in the Arctic. So 40 years ago, Frank Murkowski had the vision to put that legislation through. So we are a product of Congress. And our job is to build what I have described to you every 2 years, this goals and objectives report that goes to the president. We also advise the president and advise Congress on the goals and objectives that we put forward every 2 years, but also we are there as a resource for all of our federal agencies. We also overlook, not oversee, overlook what it is that they are doing and how we can help them advance their missions. So whether that's NOAA or the National Science Foundation or any Arctic research capacity within the United States, we take a look at what they are doing and ways we can advance their agenda, which most often reflects where the Commission thinks the U.S. should go. So we advocate, but we also have freely one-on-one institutional to institutional discussions with our colleagues in the United States about how we can advance the Arctic enterprise. This administration has asked us to take on a little bit more of a public-facing position when it comes to international cooperation, and that has been since day one in our legislation, guiding these 7 commissioners. I will tell you, I think what's interesting about the Arctic Research Commission, and we do many other things, but that's the core, is every 2 years providing the goals and objectives report. That kicks off a number of other actions. There's something called, you won't remember the acronyms here, but IARPC, the Interagency Arctic Research Policy Committee. That's a family of federal agencies that meets on an ongoing basis, led by our colleague, Dr. Larry Hensman. Our goals report goes to Larry and that interagency, from which they build a 5-year evolving research plan for the United States. Not unlike what happens in other countries and within the EU. But it starts in some ways and is iterative with the Commission. So that's the relationship between the two. But let me explain to you very briefly who we are. These are 7 individuals selected by the President to do this work. The composition is very important as reflected in the goals. There are 7 of us. 5 of the 7 are Alaskans. So the filter through which we look at US and global issues is through a true Arctic vision. 4 of the 5 Biden-Harris appointees are women. 3 of the 4 women are Alaska Native women, and not just Alaska Native women, leaders in our state. So the priorities that you heard me riddle off and are advancing and influencing US policy, whether it's in research or other policy areas, run through that lens of 7 highly qualified Arctic experts from different walks of life, but the composition is there, especially in areas like health and well-being and economic development, reflection of community and how it fits into the domestic policy and how that informs foreign policy. So that's kind of a US Arctic Research Commission 101, and I hope I answered your question.
Yes, you did. Thank you very much, Mike. Nicole, you are representing one of the largest European polar research institutes if Arctic Center of the University of Lapland is not taken into account. And you mentioned the data gaps in research in the current situation. What is the scientific community currently doing to manage these data gaps caused by the geopolitical problems or challenges?
It all comes down to cooperation, you know. We started to, first of all, look to other areas where we can at least get comparable data, not maybe not the same situation as in the Siberian Arctic, for example, but something which helps us to define the process is the models, to support the models. And we initiated a much closer cooperation with our US and Canadian partners and moved a bit from Russia to North America. We initiated and discussed also on a European level a much more intensive cooperation, because some of the data is there, but maybe somewhere in cupboards, you know, so that we can exchange more data and also develop best practices and also share our expertise. And this is also, we initiated a much more closer cooperation now, and we are working on that, with the remote sensing community, so ESA, for example, and Copernicus. They have a lot of data which can close our gaps at least a little bit, you know. So there is still this gap because we are working, or we have worked in the Siberian Arctic not just for fun, because there is the place to go. But we can at least compensate a little bit with all these points I have listed. And we are still trying, so from the AVI perspective, to keep our long-term observatories with the data from 30 years running on a scientist-to-scientist level, so that this data is not get lost. But we don't expect that we will work in the Siberian Arctic within the next 20 years anymore. So that's why we are really looking how we can understand the most important processes which define climate change by other parameters and by cooperating with partners. This is maybe the most important point, cooperation here.
Thank you very much. I have a question from the audience, but before I give the floor, I would like to ask the other panelists that would you like to also comment on this question about data gaps and how to fulfill the possible data gaps? No? Not too much of interest. Okay, good. Here was a question from the audience.
Yeah, this is Turkel Peters from the External Action Service. I wanted to ask Nicole, this research station at Lena, the river Lena, which is far out in the, the Central Asia part of Siberia, I guess, it's at the hard north. Did you manage, before you had to close it, to get a grasp of how permafrost affects the infrastructure, roads, housing, ports of Russia? And would you dare to assess how much it would threaten the Russian economy if all of that had to be rebuilt with deeper foundations?
We have, tricky question for me, Tackle, thank you. So we have 2 EU projects since a long time running, which are working on that, as you might know. So page 21 was the first one, and the Nunatajok is currently ongoing. And there's a significant effect of thawing permafrost on the infrastructure. And it is also, with that, a significant effect on the economy. But I cannot give you numbers.
I guess Veli-Pekka would be the expert here.
Well, I've been looking at this issue from the energy sector perspective, and of course, if you look at Russian energy production, it's by far Arctic, and especially on the side of gas, it is really Arctic, and that production, and the fact that actually Russia's decision, Putin's regime's decision to invest in fossil energy, that's their goal, has been for 20 years and is going to be, that production is going to be more Arctic, more Eastern. And those are the permafrost areas. And we know that approximately 80% of that permafrost-based energy production has been impacted by thaw already. I don't know the magnitude, but has been impacted.
Thank you very much. I have many questions now from the audience here pending, but before I go to them, I'll ask a few more questions here, if that's all right. Thank you. Rasmus, I've never heard of, and this is just indicating my ignorance, I've never heard of a term called Arctic exceptionalism. And you asked me to ask you, is it dead? What is it?
Can we have some coffee, please, first? I think it was. I'm actually working on a paper where I spend a lot of time discussing Arctic exceptionalism, and Arctic is not something that happened in February of this year. That someone said now we had Arctic exceptionalism, now it's dead. That several people have been saying that Arctic exceptionalism has been winding away or going over to more geopolitical argument, but it's basically an idea that goes back. Someone says this goes back to Gorbachev's Murmansk speech in '87, that the Arctic should be a zone of peace. The ICC, you saw my colleague Sarah Olsvig yesterday, in the indigenous people of Inuit, been saying that the Arctic should be a zone of peace, as something detached from geopolitical problems elsewhere. And that has been a problem for some time, and the paper I'm writing is actually trying to put some of the argument of Arctic exceptionalism, what makes the institutionalized cooperation until recently that good in the Arctic, but also making assessments concerning the hard security issues. So that was based on a paper. I got revisions last night, and they're not too bad, so I will hopefully be in the Journal of Scandinavian Military Story earlier next year, and you can read much more about the Arctic exceptionalism. But that's also an argument that in terms of low politics, so non-military issues, that the Arctic has been particularly good at cooperating. There's actually quite a lot of cooperation going on in the Arctic, and that is what is become very, very difficult now. But I wouldn't, in contrast to most, I won't say that Arctic exceptionalism is dead, but it's going back to your first question on how that we basically need to make some of the things that make the Arctic exceptionally good at cooperating, also in research. We have to come back to that. But then maybe to also a little bit of a furtherance to my first question. Someone said we don't really know, we know the short term that we should not cooperate now, and the long term we should cooperate something, but we have some really hardcore dilemmas. I can give a couple of examples from my own experience. Very early in early March, we were supposed to have a symposium in Nuuk, and we were supposed to have a Russian scholar online, and we had a lot of discussion with the Greenlandic MFA, the Danish MFA, whether we should continue. We actually had a discussion whether we could have this person online, because there was a geo-blocking on the internet in Greenland from Russian IP servers. And everybody was in agreement that we should continue and make this collaboration, invite a Russian scholar to the symposium. And then his university started to make sanctions against people who were against the war. And all of a sudden came from like a scholar to scholar, a researcher to researcher problem, that we said we should invite this person to an institutional issue. And then everybody was very fast in agree we shouldn't go on with this. So just to say that maybe you think our research, we are just too abstract, but we have some really concrete dilemmas how to move forward in terms of this, and also that we really have to make the working groups of the Arctic Council work again. You heard maybe yesterday that some roughly 80 projects are still going on, but without Russian contribution as of now, and we need to get to the next one. So there's some really hardcore dilemmas how we have to go on that, so we can safeguard some of what make the Arctic exceptional in terms of collaboration, but also in terms of science diplomacy, whatever that means.
Thank you so much. Even a biologist could understand the answer. Peter, you are here representing science diplomacy. Would that be a kind of a vehicle to get closer to Russia or to get parts of the cooperation with Russia back?
I hope so. I think science play a crucial role in the re-establishment of conditions, however they will look like. Just reminding you of what happened 8 years ago after the Crimea incidents or invasion in 2014. And Russia continued to send invitations to our countries, and the governments rejected these invitations, and they were passed on to the diplomats, and the ambassadors rejected them, had to reject them. And then the question went to the scientists, who were then told by the governments to respond positively. So we went over to Russia also in 2014 and 2015 when many other relations were paused. And the idea behind this was to have some kind of a continued dialogue. And that was, I can say today, important because it prevented a knowledge gap that should otherwise have appeared and gave us better opportunities, not only for research, but for the relations between our countries. Now the situation is very different. Now there is an ongoing war, and just today it seems almost impossible to understand how the relations can be restored. But as I said, I have decided to be optimistic, and I want to believe that there will be cooperation in the future. And I think that research needs to take on the role as test pilots to build up this confidence and trust again. That will be not only through research cooperation, I think that is very important to state, but education plays an important role here too. We need the young students and early career researchers to cross the borders and to find friends and colleagues again. The conditions will not be equal from a few years back, but we have to accept the fact that is the situation, and we need to take it on from there.
Thank you very much. What about Anna-Maria? How do you see the science diplomacy from the EU point of view?
I already said that international cooperation is one of the priorities for Arctic research at EU level. And science diplomacy, of course, it's very important. And I think research has always been international, but I think it's even more pertinent for polar research for different reasons. For the Arctic, we have, prefer to give examples, so we have I mentioned the Arctic Science Ministerial, which was an extraordinary initiative of countries interested in Arctic research to come together and to commit on common objectives and commit to support Arctic research with the very concrete objective to tackle climate change and environmental degradation, biodiversity degradation. The Commission was part of that along the member states. Now that process stopped for the moment, unfortunately. So I'll mention a process that the EU, the Commission initiated actually together with the US and Canada, and I'm referring to the All-Atlantic Ocean Research Alliance, which started with the Galway Agreement in 2013. They will celebrate their 10 years next year. And it is about marine research, so it started with the North Atlantic countries, but it extended afterwards to the South Atlantic, signing agreements with Brazil, South Africa, then Cape Verde, Argentina, Morocco also. It's about marine research, but it has the ambition to have a research line from pole to pole, and polar research is one of the priorities of the Alliance. So what does this mean concretely? It's that we have a framework through which we can reinforce research cooperation with, if I talk about the Arctic, it would be with especially the United States and with Canada. And on this, I would also like to say that Canada is in the process of signing an association agreement with Horizon Europe, meaning that they will be able to fully participate as member states to the projects. Well, this doesn't mean, for example, that US universities already participate in the projects. The only difference is that they pay for their own participation separately. It's a technical difference. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna-Maria. I have a question both to Veli-Pekka and to Karen. Veli-Pekka, how do you see how to build interdependency and peace in EU-Russian relations, and consequently, does a non-Arctic state like Belgium have a role in this? Veli-Pekka, you can start.
If I start, it's a very long story, and in a sense, I think how we're going to build future relations with Russia has to do with very much to do with the fact that how we can learn from our nearest history, and I think especially the years after 2014, when Russia started the war in Ukraine, invaded that country already, the political decisions just explained by my colleague here. That we, in many different forms of societal life, continued business as usual with Russia, be it energy policy, be it scientific cooperation. We continued the sanctions that we posed on Russia after 2014. Very many of my colleagues call it, from the energy side, Mickey Mouse sanctions. And I, knowing the Russian discussion, knowing the Russian discourse and the imperial mindset that has been there all along, I think this is very wrong policy. We actually put gasoline to the flames for Putin's and his entourage, and unfortunately to very many Russians' objectives to be a colonial power. And we should have done differently in 2014, especially after that. And I think the scientific cooperation, as I said, doesn't live in a vacuum. It's part of the society. It's part of the kind of political decisions related to Russia. And I understand the fact that in natural sciences, it's really easy to be kind of within this bubble among natural scientists discussing about physics, about ice and so forth, about climate, and you're kind of isolated from the political issues. But still, you are part of the political kind of life. And as I said in my first speech, that Russia has utilized these kind of soft ways to influence the West that continue business as usual. And if we want to build peace with Russia in the future, I think at this point, we need to isolate Russia fully. That concerns institutions of Russia. Individual scholars, that's a different story. But institutions on all forms of life, we need to isolate Russia. That's the only way that we can actually tell to the Russian society, this is not Putin's war, this is Russia's war. We need to tell to the Russian society, this is not okay. And if we continue business as usual, we're not telling that story. So in that sense, how we're going to build that future cooperation is that we isolate Russia now, but we also at the same time build a Russia strategy, giving hand to that part of Russia, which is maybe 10-15% of the population, which is European-minded, which favors democracy. We need to tell them, we have a plan, a common path for us if you choose differently. But unless we isolate Russia, we're not able to do it. And I think the academic society community is very much part of that same strategy. We need to build a Russia strategy which aims at peace in the future. But as I said, now we need to isolate, unfortunately.
Thank you. I will start with the easy part of the question of what non-Arctic states like Belgium can bring to the table. There's been a lot of talk in the past day as well about cooperation with the like-minded and the willing. From the side of Belgium, I would like to add the capable as well. We have the know-how, we have the capacity, and also we are such a small country, but multinationalism and multilateralism and international cooperation are part of our diplomatic DNA. So I do believe that certainly in these conditions, we should be present, we can be present, and we can make a good contribution. When it comes to Russia, I must say that on a personal level, I have done part of my studies in Ukraine, and I have worked and lived in Russia in 2 of the institutions that are on this infamous lists that supported the special military invasion. And there has been so much talk yesterday as well about this cooperation with the like-minded and the willing, but we seem to forget that also on the Russian side, there are some people that fall under that category. Russia is waging a brutal war against Ukraine. There are lots of frozen conflicts in their neighborhood, but we should also not forget that for the past few decades, Russia has been viciously attacking its own people and its own population as well. Political opposition nearly diminished, civil society practically eradicated, academic freedom leaves a lot to be desired. But what can we do for those who do not support the regime, who are willing to contribute, especially on the topics such as climate change, which I agree are not in a certain bubble. Climate change didn't happen overnight. Climate change is also a result of political processes and decisions. So I do not have the answer to this question, but I think it needs to be looked at into greater detail. What can be done to support the people that are eager and willing and Western-minded to work with us? I'll leave it.
Thank you, Karen. I can feel that there is a lot of questions in the air, and unless your biological clocks are alarming for lunch, I would like to continue for 10 more minutes, if that's all right. Here was a lady in baby blue jacket who had a question. Is it still valid?
Thank you. My name is Marianne Koenings of the Egmont Institute, as Karen. The Egmont Institute organized a workshop a couple of months ago exactly where this theme was being addressed. And it was one of the most heated discussions that we had. We had the politicians and we had the researchers. And I mean, they reflected the researchers a lot what we heard here, but the outcome was very clear. I would say that there can be no exceptionalism, exactly as the Finnish colleague said. You cannot make an exception for science in the cooperation. And a second conclusion was you have to continue to work with the willing and use this opportunity to have maybe new actors to cooperate with. My question actually was dealing with the permafrost research. I had the honor and pleasure to visit the Wegener Institute some years ago, and they were very proud of their cooperation with Russia, particularly on the permafrost. They showed me a book of 20 years of cooperation with Russia on the permafrost. So I guess that in these 25 years, in the meantime 30 years, the Wegener Institute has an enormous amount of research knowledge about permafrost and the causes and everything. So will this a possible gap of a couple of years, maybe now, will be a serious gap? That's one thing. And secondly, I said I lived and worked in Canada. The permafrost in Canada and in Alaska is huge, huge, huge. And I don't know if so much research is being done, but this can be an occasion maybe to reinforce the permafrost in other areas and compare. So my point is, I think that people are exaggerating the research with Russia, although it's extremely important. But this pause will be necessary in the next years.
Thank you very much for the question. Who would like to answer first?
I think I should comment on this. It is not the understanding of permafrost as such. It's long-term data, you know, long-term data of carbon exchange. You know that our models at the moment do not reflect climate change in the Arctic. They are still not good enough, and we need these long-term data to improve the models, and you need the models to make prediction about the future of the Arctic and of Europe. So that's why we are insisting in our long-term data observatories. And we have chosen Siberia not only because it is obvious for reasons to, we chose it because there are the key locations for permafrost. But we are focusing a bit too much on permafrost. This cooperation in the Russia is, for example, the birthplace of sea ice. So the Lena Delta and the Laptev Sea, there is where the sea ice is formed. So there are key processes which we cannot easily transfer to other areas. That's why we are working there. And please understand me, and maybe we fully understand that we have to have a ban working with Russia. And we do this in Germany, maybe more extremely than any other country. I only want to make clear that when we speak about climate change, this is a severe backdrop which we have when we are not accessing anymore the Russian Arctic. Because here are some key processes taking place for our understanding of the Arctic. And that's why we hope in a way that we can return. But we are also fully aware that at the moment, our cooperation is not taking place anymore.
Thank you, Nicole. Peter wanted to comment on that, and Veli-Pekka as well.
Yes, well, just a very brief comment, concluding that I agree very much with Veli-Pekka that isolation is the strategy now, and that is not even in our hands. That is our governments who decide if we should or not isolate Russia. And I agree, they must be isolated today. That goes not only for research, that goes for cultural cooperation, the World Cup, the Olympic Games, whatever. They should not be there under conditions we have today. But my perspective is perhaps a bit more long-term, forward-looking. There will be a time for reconciliation. There is, I would say, always after wars, a time for reconciliation. That might take decades from now, but I think that we must begin to prepare for that process already today, so we are not taken by surprise when the day eventually comes.
Yeah, I fully agree. That was my idea, that we need a Russia strategy where we look into the future, decades ahead. Concerning, yes, I understand, again, from the natural science perspective, that this data that you've been gathering in the Arctic, in Russian Arctic, is extremely valuable. But at the same time, if you look at on a global scale, research funding that is being diverted to climate change research, 95% goes to natural sciences. Only 5% goes to social sciences. And we know what the problem is. The world is heating. We need to do more political decisions. So I'm a geographer. I'm on both sides, basically. But I think this is also kind of a possibility also, maybe to divert our funding also to more to the social sciences side.
Thank you very much. And also thank you for the question. Are there more questions from the audience? Yes, please.
Hello, good afternoon to the panelists and everybody here. My name is Amir, and I'm from Paris-Saclay University. My question is that because with reference to my master thesis, which was also about the data sharing and the early warning system cooperation between not only the Arctic states, but also the Himalayan state, which is also termed as the third pole. So what I have found out is that I would also agree with Mr. Veli-Pekka that the research should also be dedicated to the social science as well, because my research found out that still the forensic investigation method, like the root causes of the climate change or the disasters occurring, they are not being addressed. And I was shocked to learn that when I even contacted some organizations within the Norway, and I asked them that they were, with respect to climate change, are you incorporating this approach, forensic investigation, in your early warning systems? They said, his reply was they don't even know that. And also like the ICIMOD organization, which is responsible for the Himalayan, and I think Mr. Mike must be knowing that it is well supported by the Servir USA as well. And they were also not so much aware about the forensic investigation. So I think on this front, on the root causes of the disasters and the climate change, the research is very much important. And also, when I think the rest of the countries, they are still trading with Russia, there is no problem for Russia. So do you think just like, abstaining from the scientific cooperation will hurt Russia any bit? Because I think that will only hurt the Arctic communities probably. Thank you.
Thank you. Was there a question included?
Yes. That's what I'm asking, that do you think that science, like abstaining from science cooperation is much more important than abstaining from trade from Russia? Because I think the world should be united to dent Russia on the economic front. Because if the still Russia is selling the gas and oil, I don't think so this abstaining from science would do anything to dent Russia. That's what I'm asking.
Thank you very much. Who would like to? Okay, Veli-Pekka, please.
Just like on the side of energy, yes, Russia is selling oil and partly gas to other countries, but they're selling it with less margin. They get less money. And the same applies, I think, to scientific cooperation. You can do research cooperation with other countries, but if you look at if US, Europe, many other democratic countries are excluded, really Russian scholars are not in the forefront.
Thank you so much. We can afford one short question and a shortish answers, please.
Oh, I'm afraid my question wouldn't be short, unfortunately, but I will try to my best. So there's a talk of Russian isolation, of course, but
please introduce yourself.
Oh yes, of course. I'm sorry. I'm Maciej Gadzawa, and I'm a student from Tilburg University College. And my question is whether, okay, there's a talk about Russian isolation in a sense, right? And but if you look at the past, in 2008, after the Georgian invasion, there was a reset. 2014, when Russia invaded Crimea, there was a lot of isolation on the level of international system, but they could still sell the gas. So basically, they did what they did, and they annexed it, and they annexed the part of the Ukraine, and then they still were able to basically balance their budget with the selling gas to Europe. So they had the cake and ate it too. And my question is rather here in 2022, if we talk about isolation, what kind of isolation we're talking about? What is the priority here? Shouldn't the priority be rather bringing Russia into the international system so that 2008, 2014 doesn't repeat? Or rather, should it be isolation so as not to have that many problems with Russia on the level of, well, the larger just, on the level of basically not having problems as much, not having to deal with that as much as we possibly are dealing with now. So this is my question, yes. What kind of isolation really? Well, what should it prioritize even?
Thank you for the question. Is it Veli-Pekka who should actually a little bit analyze what you just said to or told us?
Yes, the isolation should be maximal, as we discussed, including different forms of life and political life. The problem with previous steps taken by West, taken by Europe, was exactly the fact that when Russia increased violence, be it 2008, 2014, we increased the carrots. Look at Germany. They increased their gas dependence on Russian gas from 2014, 33%, to February 22 to 55%. While Russia was having war in Ukraine. That's a prime example. That we tried that way. We tried to Wandel du Handel, and actually the academic community was very much part of that Wandel du Handel. The idea was that we cooperate with Russia, we engage with Russia, we do business with Russia. That will tame Russia. But the problem was that we only gave carrots. And that is what we have to learn from history. Yes, we need to still provide Russia with carrots, but we also need the sticks. And that's the kind of difference that I see how future should be built.
Thank you very much. I think our adrenaline levels are high enough and the biological clock is ringing that it's lunch hour. I want to warmly thank our dear panel and the very wise panel for this discussion that actually could have continued for the entire day. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ikävalko. Thank you for the panelists. It is time, no, please be my guest. It's time for lunch. We reconvene here at 1:30 sharp. Thank you very much. Enjoy the lunch.